It's really a pleasure being here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm recovering from strep throat. I didn't even know you could get that over the summer. So hopefully my voice won't completely go. Good, I have a feeling it's going to by the end of the evening. So you're free to ask questions if you'd like to. If I can answer them, great. What I do want to avoid is, because everybody's from different parts of the country, there are some small subtleties that are regional or state by state on deadlines and things like that, so I prefer not to answer that. Our advocacy group is national for our organization, but I'm really just uncomfortable doing that for many reasons, which is that I don't know exactly what Tennessee's deadline is on something. But I think a lot of what we learn from this session comes from stories that everybody else shares. And if your story is a little too complicated or something that we kind of can't talk about in a short amount of time, then I'll say, you know what, let's table that. We can talk about it afterwards. I'll be here all day today and then all day tomorrow. I have an afternoon session, so you're welcome to come by our booth as well if you have some questions. Okay, so let's get started. Does anyone want to raise their hand and kind of share a brief story of what's frustrating for them about their child's IEP or about school? Go ahead. Yeah.
I have a 4-year-old, and she's had like 2 preschool teachers. Now she has a preschool teacher, and she be cloned, and was like master, writes really good IEPs, but just noticing that how different it was when she had this pretty incompetent teacher writing her IEPs, and how much shifted to make it good. So just like that nervousness of how much is contingent upon the special teacher.
So you're seeing differences in how the IEP is written and between teachers, and I want to catch your language there because you said how the teacher wrote the IEP. I want you to remember that because that language is going to change at the end of this session. Does anybody else have a comment they want to make? Go ahead.
We're having a struggle with ours right now where our child is really on the borderline between mainstream and going to a more restrictive environment, and a little bit of a push and pull with the school about kind of what will be the best thing, not really having enough testing in there to really define what will be best for her.
So they're pulling into special day class and you want to pull to a general education curriculum, right? Yeah, I get that. I'll share with you a little bit about my issues and where I came to this. This is my son, Henry. Before he was born, I practiced law for 15 years. That was another life for me, with long lunches and an expense account that I could, spend how much money I wanted to take my clients out and wear high heels and go to big fancy court cases and drive a really nice car and all of that. My husband and I got married in our late 30s because we were both very career driven. And my first son was born with a condition called hemimegalencephaly, where half his brain was massively deformed. He started seizing in utero, and this is the first of 10 brain surgeries he's had. This was when he was 3 months old, where we disconnected and removed most of the left half of his brain. And I give you that background only to drive home one issue, that through those 10 surgeries, I never cried once, not once, because it is what it is, and there's really nothing I can do for him medically. Where I could not keep it together was in the mediation with a school district locally that wanted to put him into a special day class, bus him 1 hour there with 0 services. And I couldn't stop crying because after practicing law for 15 years, I could not figure out the IDEA process. So I'm bringing my knowledge to you and my experience so that you walk out of here without ever feeling like I did at that moment. Knowledge is power, and I want you to remember this. You have to know something. You have to, if you want to advocate for your child, you have to understand it. You have to understand it. You have to know the brain, and that's what you're all learning about at this conference, right? You have to understand your child's disabilities, what their challenges are. You must understand the IEP process. That is an absolute must. And then you have to understand interventions and teaching strategies. And we're not going to have time to do the latter one especially because, like I said, in our sessions at our conference, we would do a 6-hour training here, and then on day 2, we'd break out into 2-hour sessions depending on the reading intervention you need or the one-to-one aid. But today, you're going to learn the IEP process. IEPs stand for what? Incredibly excessive paperwork, right? That mom is familiar to you, isn't she? She's totally flustered. I want to share here that if you think you're crazy, that's exactly it, because it's a broken system. It's a totally broken system. You walk out of an IEP and feel like you're going nuts. Yep, that's about right. Don't get overwhelmed. Please don't get overwhelmed in this session. Know that you're going to chunk your learning. You're not going to walk out of here knowing everything 100%. You're going to have a really good overview. This stuff is really difficult. If you think it's easy, you are not doing it right. So I do want you to walk out of here and go, oh my gosh, I have a lot more reading to do. I have to look into this and I have to look into that. That's right, because this is not easy. I want you to keep a very organized file. I want you to know that if it is not in writing, it did not happen. Remember that when you're talking to people. But most importantly, IEPs are never fixed in the meeting, ever. And remember that when you're walking into that meeting, because I think a lot of us get really nervous and tense and agitated. That is the least of your worries, is that actual IEP meeting. It's what happens before it and what happens after it. Okay, we're going to go from this to this. Does everyone know who that is? What is it about Claire? What is it about Claire that's so interesting? Does she cry in an IEP meeting? No. Is she nervous about the number of people that are in the room? Does she bake cookies and bring them in? Does she walk in late, flustered with papers walking out of her briefcase? No. Now, you don't have to murder your boyfriend or anything like that at your IEP meeting, but I do want you to go from that frightened person, right, to the person that walks in and owns the room. Stop letting IEPs happen to you. You are an important part of the team, and you help that team build. So when you said the teacher built the IEP, that's not in our language anymore. The team builds it, and you are Claire Underwood in that meeting. Before we start building the IEP, you're going to assume 4 things. You're going to assume you're going to go to due process, all right? You're going to end up before an administrative hearing officer to adjudicate your child's IEP. I want you to assume that every member of the IEP team is going to testify against you. There are some really wonderful special education teachers in this world. I know a lot of them. There are some great principals, great physical therapists, but what you get when you get them up on the stand in an administrative hearing, I can promise you they are not going to testify on your behalf. They're going to testify on behalf of the school, because that's who pays their check. I want you to assume that you will not be able to testify, that the administrative hearing officer will not call you onto the stand. Now, why do I say that? Because even if you do testify, human beings are human, and the administrative hearing officer is just going to know in his heart or her heart that you are biased. Of course you want the best thing for your child. So throughout this whole session, pretend like you can't talk when you're up at that hearing. If I have a Band-Aid on the slide, it means it's a pain point for the school, so pay attention to that. All right, what is the IDEA? The Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. It is a federal law that governs all states. There are some state differences that we won't talk about here. We can talk about them a little bit privately, but they're most related to certain timelines and the definition of what specific learning disabilities are. How many of you have actually taken the time to read the statute, the IDEA? 2 people have, right? So that's the first thing you're going to do when you're going to go home. You're going to print it out and you're going to read it front to back. We're going to cover a couple of those things here. The IDEA says that disability is a natural part of the human experience. It does not diminish the right of individuals to participate or contribute in society. Improving the educational results for children with disabilities is an essential element of our national policy, ensuring what? Independent living, everybody, and ensuring economic self-sufficiency. So the law recognizes that people with disabilities have a problem with individual independent living and economic self-sufficiency. So that's the first thing that the law talks about in the preamble. That's your overriding policy. The second thing it talks about is high expectations. Isn't everyone always bringing those goals down for our kids? Why? The law says the expectations have to be high. The law says access to the general education curriculum. Is that Common Core? Is it whatever your state has? Whatever the gen ed kids are learning, your kids are supposed to be learning it as well, to the maximum extent possible. Remember these overarching policies. These are the things that should be coming out of your mouth when you're in that meeting. High expectations, general education curriculum, maximum extent possible, living independently, and economic self-sufficiency. Meeting developmental goals, challenging expectations, productive independent adult lives, yada, yada, yada. This is all just in those first few paragraphs of the law. And what is the purpose of the law itself? It's to provide children with disabilities with a free, appropriate public education. How many of you want the best education for your son or your daughter? I do, right? So everyone say best. It's the last time you're going to say it in context of IDEA, so get it out. Everybody say maximize. Last time you're going to say it. Say optimal. Say full potential, ideal, outstanding. It's the last time you're going to say those words. You can think them. You can think them all you want. I want my son to have the best, absolutely. But I'm not going to say it. I'm going to say what word? Appropriate. Very good. The education has to meet the child's unique needs. A special day class for kids with autism, is that unique needs, or is that just shoving them into something that has the right title? It's the latter, right? And it's supposed to prepare our children for a further education, whether they go to college, employment, and independent living. So for me, with my son is nonverbal. He has difficulty ambulating and his IQ is quite low. Independent living is the most important thing for me because I'm not going to be here forever. For some of you, your children quite likely have potential to go to college and live independently and be gainfully employed. So those are the overarching policies that you always want to be thinking about of why the school is supposed to provide you with FAPE. This is the IEP process. This is it. This is your cheat sheet. This is what you take with you into your IEP meeting. If you're frustrated with something, you have to figure out where the gap is in the process, right? And if you follow this process exactly like I tell you to, you're going to have an excellent IEP out the door. All right, so step one. Whose child is not in special education, is just on a 504? One. Okay, so all referral means is that the child is referred to the special education department of the district because the district has reason to believe the child may need special education services. So when does a district think that a child may need special ed? It's because mother's concerned, dad's concerned, one of the teachers is concerned. If the child is in private school, the private school can call and say, I have a child that really has a problem with fine motor. I think they need an assessment. That's it. That's the referral in the door to special education. We're not going to talk about that too much because, of course, most of your children are in special education. Some districts will say, you know what, you don't get special ed if your child is high functioning because we first have to exhaust what we call RTI tiers, response to intervention. So we want to see if he or she exhausts this before we even start special ed. That's not true. You can be at the bottom tier of RTI and you can still trigger special education assessments. So just remember that for those of you who are in just a 504 and you're starting to think about special ed, you don't have to exhaust RTI. Okay, we are going to spend a good 45 minutes on assessments. Step 2, assessments. The school's comprehensive evaluation plan assesses the child in all areas of suspected disability. You can disagree with their evaluations and request independent evaluations. That's the overview of step 2. I tell my families the number one rule for you to always remember I said you couldn't talk at an administrative hearing? You're not going to be called up to the witness stand. You are, but we're pretending. What mommy wants doesn't matter. It has to be in the assessments, because if you say, this is what I want, this is what my kid needs, and I think you're not a doctor, you're not a physical therapist, you're just mom in this context. So everything that your child needs, all of his strengths, weaknesses, the interventions, the recommendations, must come in those assessments. That's why these are so important. Child find is a pain point for the district. They have to identify all children with disabilities in the district. They have to locate, identify, and evaluate by law under the IDEA. So they have to make sure once you say, you know what, you need to evaluate my kid, that they do it, or else it's a pretty hefty issue for them. Here's where you do have a voice. So when you're going in to get evaluations, you draft what we call a parental concerns letter. Draft this before the IEP meeting, before your evaluations, months ahead, and sit down with your significant other, or your spouse, or yourself, however you choose, and think about what it is that you're concerned about for your child. Because every concern that you put in that letter by law must be addressed in the IEP meeting. So what worries me? Well, I'm worried that my son is totally nonverbal and he really needs a ton of intervention, I think, via some sort of a specialist who can work with him on his assistive communication device. He's starting to have some pre-verbal activity, some vocalizations. They can be very disruptive. So from a behavioral standpoint, it's really hard for us to go out to dinner. It can be disruptive in the classroom. I'm frankly worried about what's going to happen when I go. So is he going to be able to communicate needs like pain? Is he going to be able to communicate the location of pain? That he wants to go to the bathroom, that he's tired? Those are my concerns. And so in my letter of parental concerns, that's what I put. I have other concerns. He's ambulatory but not great. He has a terrible visual field cut. He can't use one arm. I'm really not going to put those in the letter because my top 3 are what I just told you about. If you make your letter too long, it is your right by law, but you're going to get eye rolls internally at the administrative level. Wow, look at this 10-page letter from the Smith family. Look at all these things they're worried about. And then right then, you become a pain in the you-know-what for the school, right? You've done that. I can see that. You probably just did it, didn't you? Yeah. Right. Because we want the best, right? And we're coming out of this moment of frustration in the IEP meeting, but you got to step back and think, this year, what are the top 3 most important things that you want for your kid in school? If you're in private school, again, same thing. Even though you're private paying, you can still write to the school district and say, we need evaluations. Get a letter from your child's neurologist that lays out the diagnosis and how the diagnosis affects these categories, because these are disability categories in the IDEA. Don't get a letter from your doctor that is a prescription for services. The school does not have to follow that. So if your doctor says, I'm prescribing 3 hours per week of PT and 1 hour of OT, that's totally meaningless. That's going to get thrown in the trash. What they do have to do is look at the letter from the neurologist that's saying this child either has or will likely have issues with visual processing, visual spatial motor skills, problems with the visual field. What hearing issues does the child have, or may the child have, right? Maybe you're not sure. Yeah, they passed a hearing test, but according to my neurologist, there's all this white matter stuff going on and we're missing this part of the temporal lobe, and maybe there's more. So you just want the neurologist to lay out this area may be a concern, because then the school will know where to perform their evaluations. The evaluations are the most important part of the IEP process. There is no other section really that's more important. You need an expert, remember, because you can't talk, right? Because you're not allowed to talk in the due process hearing, that talks about the child's strengths, the child's weaknesses, the interventions. And the first thing a lawyer is going to ask you, if and when you file for due process, the lawyer's going to say, well, what do the evaluations say? I know you wrote your 11-page letter where you were really angry about whatever was happening, and this is what you want for your son, but you tell me what the evaluations say. And you want to be able to hand over these evaluations to counsel, to go through it and goes, wow, yeah, you're right, that they've got a problem here. I'll take this case. So very, very important to make sure you have the right evaluations. How do you get them? Well, let's talk about what assessments are needing for a kid that has a different brain. All of our children have different brains, some more different than others, right? All these different cool parts of the brain. This is, again, a 6-hour session in our conference, but the parts that look at speech and smell and auditory processing and all the various things that the brain do can be affected in kids with different brains. We've talked about the corpus callosum quite a bit these past few days, but you know how important it is, and that if it's missing, that there can be a lot going on. So the first thing, let's just click down the top of the list, vision. Acuity, how sharp is the child's vision? That's easy, right? They have an optometrist or something at the school or at the main office that can test your child's vision, or you can go do that, right? And you can come in with a report that says, well, yeah, you're right, my kid has 20/250. Okay, not a big deal. Second, ocular motor control. Do they have eyeball movement control? What are their visual fields like? Do they have a left or right visual field cut or a scotoma? Or do they have problems with the upper or lower visual field? Do they have problems with visual processing? They can see fine in their eyes, but when the message gets to the brain, they have trouble with figure ground discrimination or all of these other various things that can happen. That is your neuro-ophthalmologist. So that's who you go to locally. And then functional vision. How does your child use vision? My son has a full field cut, so he's what we call half blind. He cannot see all the way to the right. So he's got to turn his head, and he's got to stop, and he's got to look down. The teacher of the visually impaired and the orientation and mobility specialists at school would assess him to see how it is that he uses his vision in the classroom. If you don't have if you can't afford a neuro-ophthalmologist, does the school have to pay for you to get a diagnosis from that neuro-ophthalmologist? Yes or no? Yes, they do. Yes. They don't tell you that, though, but they do have to pay for you. If you need a diagnosis in order to determine whether your child gets services, yeah, they've got to pay for you to go see a neuro-ophthalmologist. Hearing, again, hearing acuity. I'm not familiar with the hearing issues that your children have, but I'm relatively certain most of them pass a hearing test, or do some of them have acuity issues as well? Right? So that's the first thing, is can they hear? And the second thing is, what do they hear? So your peripheral hearing can be fine, but once that message gets to the brain, is that child hearing what you or I would be hearing? The school nurse and typically the school audiologist would do the hearing assessment, but when you're talking about auditory processing, that has to come from a specialized audiologist that has training in central auditory processing disorders. Well, we don't do that here, right? Is that what the school will usually tell you? We don't do that here. This is Tennessee, ma'am. We're just a small school in a small district. But would the boys go to football if we had to pay for all the kids to have this assessment? Right? Have you heard that one? It's very expensive. Not my problem, I'm sorry. You have to pay for it. So my son needs an auditory processing assessment. You have to go out and hire somebody to assess. I'm sorry, Tennessee. Sorry. That was my best Tennessee accent, which is also my Scottish accent and my Russian accent. Auditory processing in the population of kids I work with is a very serious thing, and I'm sure it might be for your kids too that are missing all these interhemispheric connections and may have other issues going on with the brain. Do they have dichotic listening? Are they able to assess what sound is coming into which side of, which ear at the same time? Can they localize? So if they were to close their eyes, can your children tell where the sounds are coming from? Why do we care? Well, when do we localize sound? When you're crossing the street. When you're crossing the street, don't you hear the car before you turn to look at it? So that is really important to understand if the kid can localize. Can they lateralize? Can they figure out the acoustic scene? If your child goes onto a playground, do they hear the basketball bouncing over here and the children running over here and the teacher yelling at them behind them? Or is it a cacophony of noise that makes it so very difficult for them to integrate onto that playground? I don't know. An auditory processing assessment is what would help figure that out. The only issue with auditory processing is you do need an age of at least 7, and the IQ has to be in the normal range. So that is a catch with auditory processing. What we do for our children is, because they've had either the entire half of the brain removed or maybe just the temporal lobe or the temporal lobe and something else, is we get the surgeon to say it's anatomically impossible for them not to have a hearing issue because they're missing the part of the brain that processes sound. So always look back to your clinician to see if they can write a letter that supports something like that. Somebody had a question. Yeah.
I do, and it's kind of general when you're talking about, let's just take auditory processing. When you've got the acute, where the audiologist and normal hearing test, if that turns out okay, can you still insist on the processing side, particularly with this group of folks? You can still insist on that, even if the other one turns out to be okay?
Most people hear, my son sees fine, yeah, but he can't see half of the world. Most children in our population, they hear fine. They can hear the fire truck coming. They can't tell you where it's coming from, right? They can hear the basketball and the teacher shouting on the playground, but it creates a cacophony of noise that makes them say, I can't be out here. I need to go back in the classroom. So yeah.
A trigger on that first step for you to say,
No.
I want this for my child.
No.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
You said that we can get our own evaluations if we disagree with the evaluation from the district. Do they hold less weight than the district?
We'll get to that. But on some of these things, right, so I've got great insurance coverage. Most of you may. I'm not going to bother the school for a neuro-ophthalmology assessment. I've got my folks at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. We go there on a regular basis. I'm going to pull it. Henry's got this and this and this and that. You take it to the school, terrific. Yeah. We'll get to where it's really important to do the independent evaluation. Orientation and mobility. So the orientation and mobility specialist, sorry, it's missing there in the bottom right-hand corner, or the teacher of the visually impaired, it's one of the two that does this, should evaluate your child in static environments. So this is a static environment, nothing's changing really. All the seats are in the same place. My son can ambulate this pretty well. Could he ambulate it if we were all around and walking, a dynamic environment that's always changing, like a playground? No way. So the O&M assessor must assess him in here and in the classroom, but also on the playground to see how he uses his vision and how he is able to orient himself in space and move in space. They should do it in a familiar environment, and they should also do it in an unfamiliar environment. Because that's life, right? Sometimes you're in a place where you get it, and sometimes you're at Disneyland where everything's moving so fast you don't really even know where you are. And they have to do it in conjunction with the audiologist, the physical therapist, maybe with some consult with a psychologist. All of these different areas should be consulting with O&M to make sure that they're all integrating. So if the child has a significant visual field cut, the O&M specialist should know that. If there's an intellectual disability, the O&M specialist should know that. They should all be meeting to talk about this. Gross motor, we've all had the PT assessment, right? That's just the gross motor. They look at strength, endurance, balance, and coordination. For those of you who have children that are more impaired or more challenged physically, are primary wheelchair users, or who fatigue easily, or who, like Henry, really have trouble ambulating, they're going to have to look at functional mobility. So they're not going to be out there kicking a ball and throwing the ball, but how do they step up onto the driveway from the pavement, or how do they open the door going into the classroom? That's easy. The PT assessment's typically always pretty good, at least in my experience. Fine motor, sensory processing, and activities of daily living. This assessment is almost always several of them, and it's usually done by the occupational therapist. So he or she is going to look at your child's fine motor strength, dexterity, and coordination, visual motor integration, but he or she is also going to look at self-care. So whether your child can toilet independently, can he or she change his own diaper, can he go number one, but number two by himself? Does he eat? How well does he eat? Can he self-feed? My son can self-feed French fries, but is a mouth stuffer and doesn't have the visual motor to bring the spoon up to his mouth. Can he dress? Can he kind of take the shirt off, tie his own shoes? These are all things that should be addressed by the school. So the occupational therapist is going to look at this as well. Speech and language. I put a star by this because I think this is very important regardless of where your child is on the functional spectrum. The speech therapist is going to look at articulation, prosody, which is your intonation and the stress of your voice. I think the Kardashians are ruining the world because everybody talks like this, and I have a jar in my house that says no up talking, and so when kids come over and they up talk, they actually have to put a quarter in the jar. So that's intonation and stress, or if your child speaks really monotone and nobody really wants to talk to them because they don't know that. Or are they a really close talker and they're really up to your face all the time? This is all part of speech. This is all part of the pragmatics, the give and take. Are they asking questions at the right time? Do they know when to pause and wait for the person to respond before they then ask a question? Same thing. This is all speech. From the articulation, whether your child can speak, all the way to the appropriateness of speech in a social context. Right. The next is language. Just generally, what words does your child use to describe something? Is their vocabulary that of a child who's 3? Do they speak at all? Are they using great big words? My 8-year-old is hilarious, and he uses words that my husband and I sometimes just go, I don't know what that means. I have to look it up. That is a really big word. So you want to make sure that the speech therapist is, again, not looking just at articulation, but the words your child is using. If your child is nonverbal like my son, or only partially verbal, or uses specific word, it's slipping my mind, when they just make a sound that I know what he means. Thank you, word approximation. I know what he means when he makes this particular grunt. It means my iPad is dying and you need to plug it in. I'm not kidding, that's what it means, right? Or when he wants a Coke. Nobody else around him knows what that means. So he really needs an augmentative assisted communication evaluation as part of that overall speech and language, because he needs a device to replace his natural speech with sound. Some children who are verbal still need an AAC device. So don't look to the AAC evaluation as something that's just for the nonverbal kids. If your child is really having trouble with pragmatics even, that AAC device may be able to help. And a really good AAC evaluation is going to tease that out. In addition to that, the AAC device, AAC evaluation not only figures out whether your kid needs it, but what device to use. If your child is fully non-mobile, primary wheelchair user and only has eye gaze, that evaluation will determine which eye gaze software and which, is it the Tobii Dynavox that's going to work? Terrific. They're going to bring it in and see if your child has the proper neck control to even get the eyes over to there so that they can start to manipulate the device. So speech and language, very important in social context if you can talk, and if you can't, still very important to be able to communicate your needs. Educational. We've all had the school psych come out with their educational evaluation. It's usually not very good. Sorry if there are any school psychs in here. They have to look at academics. So where is your child in terms of academics? Reading, math, writing, social studies, all of the other topics. We're going to get back to this a little bit. Oh, no, never mind. We're going to do it now. For those of you who have kids, this is mild to moderate. I forgot which session this was, mild to moderate. This is something that I think is really very important. Your child has to learn how to read, and they have to comprehend reading. So when I asked you earlier, when you said, what are the top 3 things for my kid? I really hope in my heart until they graduate out that it's reading, because we all seem to worry so much about inclusion and mainstreaming and all of these other things. But when I was at the COPA conference last year, I think it was the executive director of one of the Down syndrome associations. She has an adult child, and she said, there's nothing more exclusive, in other words, making you feel left out, than being illiterate. So focusing on reading is so important. That educational assessment has to tease out what we call the big 5. Does your child have what's known as phonological awareness? Are they able to hear, identify, and manipulate individual sounds of words? That the P makes the P sound, that the A makes the sound, that the T makes the T sound, and that together they form the phoneme pat or cat. Do they understand phonics? Can they sound out words? Can they sound out consonant vowels? Can they sound out consonant vowel consonant? How are they, sorry, my words are tripping. As I'm saying my words are tripping. Can they do all those things? Fluency. Fluency is not just speed. I think a lot of districts think it's how fast your child can read, so they're doing them on all these timed evals. It's more importantly accuracy of reading. So are they reading at the appropriate speed? Are they reading out loud accurately? And it also means prosody. If your child is reading like this, that's really not very useful in life, and also you're not really getting the meaning if you're reading to somebody else. That prosody of reading, how they're reading to another person, is very important. Vocabulary. What's their expressive vocabulary? Do they understand the meaning of the word rat? You know, I don't know how advanced your kids are, but then once you're getting into high school, are they starting to do high school level vocabulary? What's their receptive vocabulary? If you speak these words to them, or if they read them in a book, do they get it? Do they understand what these words mean? And then the same thing for actual writing. But then most importantly, and we talked about, one of the speakers, Dr. Brown, actually, I think it was you, who talked about comprehension really being a challenge in some of the adults who have agenesis. What's the purpose of reading? I can read French just fine. I can promise you that. I can read Portuguese just fine. I don't understand it though. So of the big 5, the most important is, does your child understand what they're reading? So make sure that educational assessment teases out comprehension and comprehension level. The 6th thing is lexile level. So you always want to make sure that educational assessment, at a minimum, gives you the child's lexile level. The lexile levels go all the way up to 12th grade. And the reason for this is so that you can know where they are today, but then in a year from the IEP meeting, you can very accurately track progress. So it's not, oh, he's at about the second grade level, he's doing okay. He's at about 2.5 mid-year. No. I want to know Lexile level. I want to know the exact Lexile level so that I can chart it. We're going to talk about this a little later. So that I can chart it meticulously through the year. And then when we get to that next IEP meeting, we see if he made grade level progress, so went from 230 to 360, or do they say, oh, he's doing really well, he's met all his goals. Oh, you know what, he only went from a 230 though to a 270 Lexile level in 1 year. Something's wrong here. We have to increase services. Psych versus neuropsych. Dr. Brown, I should ask you what the difference is, but okay. The psych is pretty basic. School psychologists can generally do it, just evaluates basic cognitive function and personality, but it really doesn't give us the ability to understand the underlying neurological processes that are going on. Every single child with a different brain must have a neuropsychological assessment. I would give my right arm if my kid could have a neuropsych assessment. He can't, he's too impaired. But for those of you here that have children that can have a neuropsychological assessment, and some children who have really, really big challenges, if you find the right neuropsychologist, they can still be assessed. Go to a major university for this, or somebody that has a reputation. The neuropsych assessment is going to give you a comprehensive look at all the cognitive processes that are happening. Understanding of the agenesis and the related disorders, attention and concentration, verbal and visual memory, auditory and visual processing, visual spatial functioning, language and reading, sensory development, sensory integration, gross and fine motor, social skills, executive function, emotion, and personality. Yes.
What age should the child be to start to do a?
I mean, I know some kids that are doing it at 3. You can start there. I mean, the neuropsychologist will say, these are the batteries that are approved for a child who's 3, right? And this is where we're going to start. And then it's also important so then you can look back and see the progress that's being made in these areas. Yeah. Yeah.
What's the difference between the cans and the can-nots as far as functional ability to be able to be assessed by neuropsych? Like our son's nonverbal, so would he not have a neuropsych job?
I think he can. I think with the right assessor he can. Dr. Brown, is your team doing, your students, for nonverbal kids?
The issue always in neuropsych assessment is whether you can adjust to the child's disability in a way that still makes the test valid.
Yeah.
So there are adjustments you can make during the testing process, but if you make too many adjustments, all of a sudden you're getting a test that you don't know what it means because it's not given in a semi-standard way. So there are lots of tests that don't rely on verbal ability, nonverbal intelligence, and other tests, but so it really depends on the test. There's a whole gallery of all the list. There's 2 or 3 tests in each one of those items that can be given.
Yes.
Sorry. On the neuropsych, is it important to go to a neuropsychologist who is familiar with ACC, or can you go to, is it general enough that the evaluating exams that you should just go?
If it was me, I'd absolutely really want to go to somebody that has some significant familiarity, but I think you're not in a bad spot if you're going to a university. But remember, we're still talking about the school's neuropsychological assessment, right?
I would, however, get something off of UCC website and take it to the neuropsychologist so they're just cued to be aware of some possibilities that they might otherwise not test, because their neuropsychologists are always selecting from batteries of tested and whatever the percentage problem is, and if they don't know the percentage problem, they may not get important tests that they should. So I think the UCC website helps some information to help.
I'm getting feedback. Were you hearing it? Yeah.
So this is tricky. The school's going to say, well, we don't do that here. Definitely. We don't have neuropsychologists on staff. So you can play this 2 ways, and we'll talk about this a little bit. You can either push for them to hire a neuropsychologist to assess, which they would have to do, because remember, we don't do that here, is not an excuse. Or you can keep your mouth shut, wait for the school's educational assessment come out, and get your own neuropsych assessment. They're expensive and generally not covered by insurance, which is why I say for some families really pushing for the school to pay for it. Or you could do it through the IEE process, which is rejecting the school psych assessment when it comes out, and then have them hire an independent evaluator. And we'll get to that. It really depends on strategy and what you're comfortable with the school, what you sort of have the emotional bandwidth. I always go with the school psych because I know for my son, and getting a neuropsych is going to be really tough, but I make it pretty hard for that school psych. I mean, I go through that assessment with a fine-tooth comb and have him sometimes reassess or make him perform some more assessments. We're going to get back to this back and forth with the IEEs, but just understand that the school saying we don't do that here is enough. If you have good resources nearby, you can say to the school, you out the gate, this is called the first bite at the apple, when they do their evaluations, for them to pay for a neuropsych assessment. Functional behaviors are an issue, as I understand. So as part of that evaluation, that your child should have a functional behavior assessment. Defining the behavior, where is it happening, where is it not happening, how often, who is around when it happens, what tends to happen before. A lot of the times the schools will say, oh, no, she's fine in kindergarten. In class, well, yeah, but when she comes home, she's feces wiping, or she's hitting her brother, or she's doing all these things. That triggers the functional behavior assessment, because that kind of stuff can actually flow back to the school at some point. Then from that FBA, you have what's called a behavior intervention plan that's created that teaches the school, what they should do in order to nip these behaviors in the bud if they can. So the IEP, the evaluations have to address in all areas of suspected disability. You may have more areas that you're concerned about. We can talk about what evaluations are appropriate there. They have to use a variety of assessments. They can't just use one psychological test to determine your kids' psych issues. They've got to use several. They can't just use one physical therapy assessment. They have to use several. They have to get information about your child's function, development, and academic information. It's got to be trained personnel performing it. The school PT can't give the auditory assessment. All right? School psychologists, unless they're a PhD, cannot give a neuropsychological assessment. It has to be technically sound instruments and address the content of the child's IEP. And this is actually pulled from the statute. Look at the qualifications of the assessor. Just go onto your state's, your state's physical therapy certification website or whatever entity certifies them. Make sure they're qualified. Check the ethics rules of the organization. Are they allowed to even give that assessment in the first place? You'll be surprised. We've almost, in most situations, we've come up with these little things where, like, gosh, this person should not ever have been giving this assessment. He doesn't have the experience for it. Generally, go comb through all those evaluations. The assessor may be totally unfamiliar with agenesis, and you read those assessments and say, gosh, they don't get my kid at all. This is so wrong. Or they may have just used a screening tool that's not an actual assessment, but just some sort of a checklist that they use. That's not an assessment. Look at it. Is it an assessment, or is it just something that the school pulled together? They may not be comprehensive. They didn't use enough. The facts are wrong. I've had assessments come back where it's Jimmy Smith. It's not Henry Jones, and he was born on this day, because people are cutting and pasting because they're underpaid and overworked. Then look at the publisher's requirements for the assessment. If they're giving the Peabody, go onto the website for the Peabody publisher. Did they give that assessment in the amount of time that they were supposed to? What we see a lot is they'll say, you know what, We gave it to him on this day, and he was tired, so then we gave him the rest of it on this Friday, and then 2 months later, we gave the end of the assessment. Well, that's not valid, because that assessment says it's supposed to be done in 20 minutes, or this assessment says it's supposed to be done in no more than 1 hour. And you just did that assessment over a 3-month period, that's totally invalid. The most important thing, look at those assessments. Do they include recommendations? If they don't, go look at the ethics code for the evaluators, because most of these certifying agencies require these evaluators to put recommendations in the assessment. And it's those recommendations that we want, right? So you're evaluating my son. I want to know what we're supposed to do in class. They have to have assessment recommendations in there. This is where it does pay to hire your own assessor for the area that's important to you. So if you can afford a private neuropsych, you hire them, because they're going to put the recommendations in their evaluation. Somebody had a question. Yeah.
That's what like, so how do you navigate like in sort of medical PT or be at a school base? So like if a medical, like for medical PT or legal or legal exam, of that type of that is that better than school? What is there any way that school can attention so that knows they're way better than?
You can bring your own private PT to the school with an assessment. You can bring whoever you want to the IEP. So yeah, my son's PT has been with us for 10 years. She's at all his IEPs, and she's just as important a member of the team than anybody else. So yes, you can bring in a private assessment from your private PT or OT, absolutely. Appropriate diagnostics, all right. Oh my gosh, sorry. So now you've gotten all your assessments, right? And one of them, let's pick school psych, because I'm picking on the school psych today, is just wrong, or it doesn't have the appropriate number of assessments, or it doesn't have recommendations, or it's saying that your child is far more intellectually impaired than you know that he is, right? What do? You ask the school to pay for an independent educational evaluation. And how do you do that? Does anybody know how you do it?
You don't sign the IEP.
All you say is, I disagree. That's it. That's all you have to say. So I like you, because I think that you're a little bit like me. But you have to tell us why you disagree. I mean, what's wrong with that psychoeducational evaluation? What was it? Aren't you going to write us a 10-page letter like you did a couple of weeks ago telling me what's wrong with the psychoed assessment? What's wrong? What do you say?
I don't think I can do it right.
No, you don't have to tell the school why you disagree. You just say, I disagree with the psychoed assessment. I disagree. Now, if you want to trigger a faster evaluation response time, the dates get shorter if you say, here are the problems with the evaluation. So the school gets more time theoretically if you just say, I disagree. But if you just know it's wrong and you're not comfortable telling them why, I'm a lawyer, I know how to, look up the law and figure out with the assessment what's wrong with it. You don't have to be crazy like that. You can just say, I'm sorry, I disagree. I disagree. I'd like an independent educational evaluation. You could do it if it's insufficient, wrong, inaccurate. The district can limit the cost of it, the location of it, and the qualification level. However, if there's nobody in your immediate area, like if you're rural in Tennessee, right? I'm from LA, I'm sorry. Everything like east of a certain freeway is there for us. It drives my husband crazy because we go to Iowa all the time on vacation, and I don't know where anything is. But if there's an assessor that you need that is not local, they can't say, well, it's beyond our 50-mile limit for neuropsych, so you can't go to Kennedy Krieger or to Fuller or to Caltech for your evaluation. Too bad. If you find somebody 150 miles away, 200 miles away, they've got to pay for that assessor. Yeah, so don't let them limit you by geography alone. They will give you a list of evaluators. They will say, all right, you'd like an IE? Here's a list of the 3 neuropsychologists we recommend. Do you have to pick one of those 3? No. There might be a good neuropsychologist on that list, right? But if you have one you prefer that's 50 miles away or 100 miles away, that's the one you tell them that you're going to choose. That's the one you're going to tell them you're going to choose. Here's the problem with outside evaluations. If you go out to get your own outside evaluation, the school only has to consider it. If they do their own evaluation, they have to follow it. So, getting your own eval, it's good, you might get a better evaluation, but what we're seeing a lot now, especially in California, the school goes, oh, we've considered it. Yeah, we're not going to follow any of the recommendations. So thanks for that. We're going to do what our assessor did. So that's why I'm saying you really want the school to hire the neuropsych directly at that initial evaluation, so they have to follow their own assessments. I'm going to fly through the rest because we're already at the 30-minute mark. Always request these assessments ahead of the IEP meeting. How many of you have walked in the IEP meeting, right? You've got a 2-hour time limit on it because that's what they put on the agenda. And they've got a stack of assessments like this, right? It's happened to me so many times. No, you give them your assessments ahead of time if you have them. You got a neuro-ophthalmology assessment, email it to the teacher. You got a hearing assessment, email it to the teacher, and then email the special ed director. I would like all of the assessments finalized no later than this date so that I may review them. You always do it in writing because they're this big. They're huge. And you need the time to go through every single assessment to determine whether you want an independent one or whether you accept. If you walk into I'm jumping ahead of myself. You may have an IEP meeting coming up where you're not going to have time to do all these things. Here's what you do. You walk in and you go, oh, wow, thank you for all these assessments. There's no way we're going to finish them in this meeting. So before we even start, can we all look at our calendars so that we can set some time in the future for the next 2 IEP meetings, because this is going to take some time. Claire Underwood, that's what she would have said, right? Not frustrated IEP mom. Claire would have walked in and said that there's no way we're going to finish this. So before we start, let's get it on the calendar. Okay, easy. Step 3, identification. Now you've had all the assessments. Now you agree with them. What is your child identified as having? It's got to be one of these disabilities. Some of them trigger additional services. So what's called low incidence, blindness, hearing impairment, visual impairment, orthopedic impairment triggers some additional money from the federal government to pay for things. So a lot of the time the school districts want that as the primary designation. I don't have a problem with that. I think my son is orthopedic as primary and visual as secondary, but he's technically multiple. It's not a big deal. What it does is it triggers. If multiple disabilities was primary, the school wouldn't get a penny for any of the bracing or the seating or anything like that. So that's the IEPs are give and take. That's what you give to the district. Some parents have a problem with intellectual disability because they feel like right out the gate, your child is being identified as a child with ID and they don't want that on the IEP. I have a child with ID. I don't think it's a bad thing. I mean, this is up to you, but it should be an accurate, identification of your child. I don't think I'm with a group that cares about this, but a lot of parents in our community don't want their kid labeled, right? They don't want their kid diagnosed with something. The IDEA is not diagnosing your child with anything. Only for the purposes of this statute is it identifying your child as having one of these disabilities. So that's all. Okay, now we've done all the pre-work, right? Now you're at step 4, which is developing the IEP. This is where what mommy wants doesn't matter, again, does matter. Everything that you put in your letter of parental concerns must be addressed in that IEP. So remember I told you that a few weeks back, before you even start these assessments, they have to draft this letter, right? So you're going to talk about that at the IEP meeting, your concerns for your child. It's not going to be a 10-page letter. It's going to be 3 top things that you want so that the team can focus on that. During this IEP meeting, you're going to discuss the assessments that they gave you ahead of time, right? You're going to write present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. You're going to draft goals. You're going to determine related services and accommodations to help meet the goals. This is what a real IEP meeting looks like, right? Doesn't look like that. Yeah? Doesn't look like that. How many of you have walked into this meeting and you're already nervous? Because look at all those people that are in there, right? The PT, the OT, speech, orientation and mobility, the principal, maybe the special ed director, maybe they brought a lawyer, right? All of these people looking at you. Claire Underwood walks in and goes, OT, PT, speech, where's the district representative that has authority to fund services? I don't see them here. Oh, we'll just call main office. Nope. Somebody has to be in the room that has knowledge about the availability of resources that the district pays for. And schools do this a lot. They'll say, you know, after we draft the IEP, we're going to see if we can give him that service you want. You stop the IEP meeting right there and just say, no, these are the people that are supposed to be at the meeting. Mom and dad, or mom and mom, or dad and dad, or the parents, right? The child where appropriate. If your kid can attend that IEP meeting and you think it's appropriate for him or her, they're supposed to be there. The regular education teacher's supposed to be there. Why? My kid's in special ed. That's the person who knows about the general education curriculum. Remember what I told you at the beginning? What the IDEA says, that we're talking about giving kids with disabilities access to gen ed, so they have to be there. The special ed teacher has to be there because she or he knows about the different interventions that are being used. Somebody who can interpret the instructional implications of the evaluation results has to be there. If the school does a neuropsych or a school psych assessment, does the school psych need to be there? Yes, absolutely. Or somebody who can interpret those assessments, or else it's an invalid meeting. Don't go into an IEP meeting where the school psych doesn't show up, right? And I've had this happen a bunch of times because mom doesn't want to stir the pot, right? No, I don't know what this means. An educational specialist, if this is someone you can afford, these people are really, really helpful because they're really good at teasing out what the instructional implications are of these evaluation results. And at your choice, you can bring someone with what's called knowledge or special expertise regarding the child. Most people think this is an advocate, and it can be, but really it's somebody who really knows your kid. So in our organization, we have trained special education advocates that will call into the IEP meeting that have been trained by us that know pretty much everything you need to do from a layperson's perspective of what happens when you take out half a child's brain. If there's someone from NODCC, one of the board members or somebody who's very knowledgeable, you tell them, I'm calling in this person who runs this department at NODCC and they're hyper knowledgeable about this condition. I still don't know enough about it, so I'm bringing them in as well. And then related services personnel. So that's the PT, the OT, and all these other people that may be giving related services. They should be there too. But again, most importantly, somebody who has authority about knowledge about the availability of resources in the district must be there. And that's usually like the principal or some type of LEA representative. Okay, so you're sitting at the IEP meeting, and the first thing you do is go through what's called the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. That is what your child is doing now, presently, today. It must be updated every year, and if it's not, that's a straight FAPE violation. And I'm going to promise you something. If you go home to your current IEP and look at last year's and the year before, I will bet you almost all of you find a lot of cutting and pasting from last year's IEP to this year's. And that's wrong because it's lazy. My son's changes and improvements are very slow, but he is different than when he was a year ago. And that has to be in the PLAAF. It has to talk about how the child's disability affects involvement and progress in gen ed. It includes strengths and it includes weaknesses and it includes units of measurement. You don't want any broad psychologically PT language in there. It's got to be language that somebody who has never met your child will understand. Who's that person who never met your child? That's the hearing officer. You want that PLAAF to read so well and so clearly that when the hearing officer reads it, they have a perfect picture of who your child is at that moment. And then finally, it has to list what? Your parent concerns. All the things you wrote in that letter. The PLAAF supports the rest of the IEP. The needs in the PLAAF become your goals. Your goals define the services, aids, and accommodations that you need, and then all of that defines placement, which is the last decision you make. So again, the PLAAF is extremely important. What makes Mr. Superman PLAAF Man really strong? His muscles? What made his muscles strong? The assessments. He got strong from the assessments. So there you have it. Okay. Henry is a happy and joyful child. He greets the teachers and staff every day. He loves to play with his classmates. He enjoys playing catch with them and running and kicking the ball during recess. This is actual language from my son's IEP, PLAAF. Is he a happy and joyful child? Yep, he is. He greets the teachers every day. What do you think he does? If you'd never met my son, what is that? Hi, how are you? Fine. Hi, Mrs. Smith. How are you? I'm so excited. This is his greet. That's it, right? He loves to play with his classmates. My kid could care less about other children. When I read that, I laughed out loud. Other kids are ghosts to him. So he will sit in a classroom with other kids. He'll be out there, but he's not high-fiving Jimmy, come and catch the ball. He doesn't have any idea of other kids. He enjoys playing catch with them and running and kicking the ball during recess. My son can't run. He can't kick. I'm okay with that, but why is it in the PLAAF? You know, why would that have been put in there? It was cut and paste from Johnny's. Right. So, first stop, academic achievement. The PLAAF has to set out, remember you had that great psychoed assessment? So now in real word language, how does your kid read? How does he do in language arts, math, science, history, numeracy, cardinality and counting, math computation, problem solving, fluency of math, writing, all of these things, just think of it as a checklist. You're going to go down all of them. Again, going back to the elements of reading, very important. All these things have to be accurately described in the PLAAF, what your child can and can't do with respect to phonemic awareness, phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary comprehension, and then again, that lexile level. You want it at the beginning at that PLAAF so that you can start tracking it. So what can Johnny write? Only his name. I've seen so many of this. Johnny can write his name. It's fantastic. Right, he can only write his name, but he can't write anything else. Or the writing is really messy, or the letters are too small. You want the PLAAF to read something like what I have below, that he's on the emergent level of writing. He can use a loose tripod grips, demonstrates an understanding that print holds meaning, yada, yada, yada. You want this with all those pieces of academics. Functional performance. So school is for school, right? School is also for further education, independent living, and getting a job, right? We talked about that at the beginning, what the IDEA says. Functional performance, very important for my kid. What's the cognitive level? How's the communicative speech level? Can they hear? How do they hear? Again, everything out of those assessments we talked about earlier, now you're laying them out logically without jargon in the PLAAF, so somebody has a clear picture of your child. 6 signs of a bad PLAAF statement. It looks the same year after year. It lists test scores that are not self-explanatory. It uses high-tech language like confidence interval. That's fine in the psychological assessment. That's totally meaningless in the PLAAF. I don't know what that means. The administrative hearing judge is not going to know what that means. He's atypical. This is a clinically significant finding. Again, to the layperson, this is all meaningless. The PLAAF has to be clear. Imprecise language, low average, below average, borderline. What does that mean? It has to be laid out clearly. If somebody has to go from your PLAAF and go through a reference manual for an assessment to figure out what a word means, get it out. It's not supposed to be in there. And then vague terms, like I said with Henry, he has a great sense of humor, likes to help his teacher, enjoys peers. That's all very vague. It can mean so many different things. Now you've got your clear PLAAF statement. You've identified your child's needs. Now you can write the goals. It's fine to get draft goals from the teacher so long as the teacher has those assessments that are final. But you should also start looking at helping the team craft the goals. Don't just rely on what the team is doing. There are tons of goal banks out there, tons of great Facebook groups that have excellent information for very specific goals related to all of these needs that we've teased out in the assessments. Don't be afraid of the can'ts. I know a lot of times, and maybe it's easier for me because, my son is who he is, and I accept him the way he is. I'm not worried about the can'ts. I know what he can't do. I need that. I need to know that because the can'ts define the goals. If your child doesn't have can'ts, they don't need special ed, right? The can'ts define the goal. However, every single can't be a goal. So if I were to pull every single thing my son cannot do out of those assessments, there's no way. That's an unworkable 200-page IEP that an administrative hearing judge is going to say, come on, lady, this is too much. Pull out those things that are important from your list of top 3 things that you want for your kid. Ask yourself, so what? So he can't run. I don't care. He's never going to run, or he's not going to kick a ball. He also doesn't want to kick a ball. So I'm not going to worry about that goal that he should kick a ball. Let's just move on to something different. Again, what are your top 3 goals for your child? And when I say goals for your child, these are broad goals. These are not the actual goals in the IEP. Make sure the categories these are the 3 categories of goals you're thinking about, and then the individual goals come from these 3 things. Goals have to be measurable. Goals have to be reachable in 1 year. So the team, not the teacher, not you, the team decides what can be reached within 1 year. Goals have to be challenging. When was the last time you all heard that our U.S. Supreme Court had a unanimous decision? Does anyone know when the last time that occurred? Like 20, 30 years ago maybe? It actually occurred in a special education case last year when Colorado said that their IEPs only have to show what's called de minimis progress. That if a kid makes something more than nothing, de minimis progress, then that's all the IDEA requires. And it took 8 years for this family to go through an administrative hearing, then at the federal court level, then at the 10th Circuit level, then take it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it's really fun. If you go to the SCOTUS blog, you can listen to the oral argument. I found it fascinating, except that Ruth Bader Ginsburg kept falling asleep during the hearings. You could actually tell that she was doing that. It was a unanimous decision that de minimis is not the standard. The standard is meeting challenging objectives. All of the justices agreed. So your goals should include those academic goals, make them challenging. Don't let the school say, you know what, I'm not sure he can meet that. No. It's the services that we're gonna now get in order for him to meet that challenging objective. Functional goals, toileting, if your child has significant impairments, feeding, toileting, all those things are absolutely fine as goals. My son's on a strict toileting schedule. He swims in school. They're trying to teach him how to put his socks on. Those are all functional goals that help you be independent in life. They have to make sure that these goals show that the child is making progress in the general ed curriculum. Look at your state Common Core standards. If you're not on Common Core, you're on something close to Common Core in your state. Pull them for 5th grade. Pull them for 4th grade. Go through them and see what your kid can do. Those goals have to be tied to those standards because, again, our goal is for our children to graduate. Here's just an IEP goal formula in terms of how to write them. There's a great website called speechandlanguagekids.com. She's got great goals and goal banks, but she also has this really great one-sheeter that you fill in order to complete your goals. Yep. And I'll give you a copy of this too if you put it on the website. Oh my gosh, we're running out of time. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, fluency goal. Johnny will read a grade level passage with minimal assistance in 4 out of 5 trials with 80% accuracy. Can anyone tell me what that means? What does 80% accuracy in 4 out of 5 trials means? I don't know. Can those 4 out of 5 trials be done all through the year? Can we do one trial in September and then one in November and then one in January and then one? How are we going to know he's making progress, right? 80% is frustration level when you're looking at reading instruction. You want your kid to be at least 90 or 95% accuracy level with their reading. If 80% is the goal, they're not reading at the right level. Here's a fluency goal that makes sense. John will read an unmodified passage at Lexile level 690. Why do I know that I want 690? Because I got my Lexile earlier and I know he's at 590 and he should be at 690. At 95% accuracy in 5 out of 5 consecutive trials given over what? A 6-week period, okay? Why 6 weeks? Because we're going to collect data like that. We're going to have data collection meetings every 6 weeks, especially with relation to reading. And if your kid is not making progress, you increase the services. You don't dumb down the goal. Okay, so again, this is like a 4-hour goal writing session that we would have, but you've written the goals, you've looked them up online, the team now has 10 or 15 or 20 goals. Now your child is entitled to special education. This is specially designed instruction to meet their unique needs, including physical education. Aquatics, dance, group games, intramural sports, these are all services that should be provided for your child, in addition to adaptive PE. What's specialized instruction? Adapting the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction. This is actual language out of the IDEA. What is adapting the content? Is it modifying the classwork? Does your kid really need a modified classwork? Or are we going to really try to see if they can do what the regular curriculum requires? Methodology. What reading instruction do they need? Is it whatever service the school has purchased to teach all kids to read? Or should your child have something like Linda Mood Bell in an intensive instruction environment? Where is the service being delivered? Can your child learn how to read with 23 other kids in the class if they have an auditory and visual impairment and behavioral issues? Or should they be learning how to read in a quiet room without anyone else in there? And then to ensure that the child can meet educational standards, that means graduating with a real diploma. How many of you know what diploma track your child is on? Do you know if you're on a modified diploma track or a real diploma? I'll bet most of you are on the not real diploma or certificate of completion. If you think your child can graduate with a real diploma, put them back on that diploma track now, because that certificate of completion is meaningless. It holds nothing outside of school. Supplementary aids and services, you've got the goals now, you've defined the special education. Now they get services provided in a regular education class so that they're educated with their non-disabled peers. That might mean a one-to-one aid. Don't just put them right in a special day class. Will your child be successful in a gen ed class with a one-to-one aid? Maybe. Then he needs a one-to-one aid. Okay? Related services to help the kid meet the goals. Now this is your PT, your OT, your speech, all of these other things. Sometimes the schools talk about, well, no, that's medical. We want educational. Just quickly, the physical therapist in school, for example, provides your child with physical therapy services that address their barriers that they have in school and help them access the general education materials and help them work towards independence. It's your private PT that's getting you your kid walking and the best and all those things. The school only has to provide what's appropriate for your child to access school or the playground. So just remember that when you're thinking about what you want the PT and other services to do. These are all the related services you're entitled to if your kid needs them. Transportation, speech, audiology services, interpreting services, psychological services. Some children in our community have emotional issues related to the trauma from the surgeries. They should be getting services. Physical therapy, OT, recreation therapy, like hippotherapy. Do you guys have a horse riding place nearby? School should pay for that. Therapeutic recreation, O&M, social work services. Do you as a parent need help getting your kid Medi-Cal and all that? Then you need social work services. School nurse, your child have seizures, do they fatigue easily, do they take medication? Then they get a school nurse on campus or somebody to come see them. Counseling, medical services for diagnostic purposes, and then this is the catch-all, such developmental corrective and support services that may be required to assist the child to benefit from school. Well, for me, that's tutoring. Your child can't read or is struggling with tutoring, and you need now corrective services. So now that's one-to-one specialized instruction in literacy. Accommodations. Quickly, accommodations do not lower expectations. They're things like timing and scheduling, the setting, the presentation materials, is the print large? Do you need a slant board? All those things we're familiar with, a graphic organizer, calculator. They don't lower expectations. Those of you that have children that are, less challenged, I guess, beware of modified curriculum. Beware of modifying, because modifying just lowers the expectations and makes the gap further and further. The older they get, the more you modify, it just increases the gap between them and the gen ed kids. Beware of, I hate this, your kid is honor student for the month. He got all A's. On what curriculum? On what curriculum? That's meaningless. I want him on a regular, if I knew my kid could do it, my son, I would absolutely have him on a non-modified curriculum through 22 to get that real diploma. Last, okay, progress monitoring. The IEP has to describe how you're going to monitor progress. How are you going to measure those goals? When are those periodic reports going to be given to you? Every 6 weeks, in my opinion, for reading, you want to know every 6 weeks whether progress is being made. If by the middle of the year he's making very little progress, then you call an IEP meeting and say, you know what, this is not working. We need to increase the intervention, or we need to try a different intervention to try to work. And data. Johnny's doing great. He's making great progress. Oh, thank you for that. I'd like to see the data for that. I'd like to see the data sheets of every day that you gave the intervention, what he did, and what the outcome was. Don't just go with what the teacher is telling you in terms of progress. Quickly, this is our goal spreadsheet. After you've written that IEP, you write the goals down in a little spreadsheet, all the services to help the child reach the goal, etc., when you're going to get that progress report, and before the IEP meeting the next year, you figure out whether that goal was met or not. Don't wait until that teacher tells you. You ask yourself, has your child met that goal? And then the IEP also has to take frequency, duration, and location of supports. If you all need to leave, please do. I'm happy to continue so that we finish. Yep. Okay, when the school says no. So you've now done everything, and they said, no, we're not going to do that evaluation. Nope, we're not going to give that service. Nope, you know what, we're going to put him in special day class even though you just want resource room. So what does Claire Underwood do? Does she cry because in that meeting she's not getting what she wants? No. She says, all right, thank you. Can you give me prior written notice, please? And that's it. Take the prior out of written notice. It's confusing. It doesn't mean it has to happen before you ask for it. It doesn't make sense. It just means before they actually put your kid in the special day class, or before they pull that speech service, or before they say we're not giving that evaluation, they have to give you written notice to describe what they're doing, describe why they're taking the action or refusing to take it, describe every evaluation, procedure, assessment, record, and report that they relied on to make their decision. That is a really, really, really difficult burden to meet. They have to tell you what other options they considered and why they rejected them. And they have to describe the factors why they rejected your own evaluations. Maybe they don't want to consider them. They got to tell you why. They have to give you a notice of procedural safeguards. And they also have to, that should say resources, they have to give you resources so that you understand your rights under PWN. After you ask for prior written notice, again, always do it in writing. So send an email, say it in the IEP meeting, make sure it's in the notes, but also confirm, thank you for the IEP meeting. Again, as I stated, I would like prior written notice with respect to these various things, tick them off, and then don't say anything again. Because the failure to provide you with prior written notice is what every lawyer wants, because that is a big FAPE violation. So when you turn it over to counsel, they said, oh, look, you asked and they didn't give it to you. That's easy. We love those cases. Okay, finally, the last step is the class. The last step is the placement. So I find that parents always come to me and say, why is my kid in special day class? Or why is my kid in with all those children? Or shouldn't he be in that? Wait a second. Make sure you've done all these steps first, because placement is the last decision. It's a team decision. And special education is not a place. It is a service. It is not a prepackaged class. And please remember that. The child must be educated in the least restrictive environment with a continuum of services provided. So you start talking about whether they can be educated in gen ed, maybe with no supports, maybe with that one-on-one aid for behavior, maybe not modifying the curriculum, but accommodating them so much that they can absolutely be educated with other children. I have a friend whose daughter is primary wheelchair user, tube fed, totally nonverbal and on an eye gaze device, and she is in a gen ed class. Yeah, she's also got 8-hour IEP meetings. The most restrictive environment is your special day class or your special school, or homebound, for example, or a residential school where the child is actually removed from public school and placed in a private school where they live. And some kids need that. All I will say is, for those of you that have children with significant impairments, I remember the first time I saw one of those classes for the really affected kids. And I thought, I don't ever want my son in that class with those kids. And now I have one of those kids. And it's actually the best environment for him. He loves it. He can ambulate the whole campus himself. There's a swimming pool. They've got fantastic things for him to do. So please keep an open mind. By law, that special school that you want your kid in, and by the way, it doesn't have to be a school like Henry goes to. It can be a school for children with learning disabilities where they have intensive reading instruction all the time. That may be the appropriate placement for your school, your child, is a private school where all day they're just working on reading, or they're just working on reading and math. So keep an open mind about the curriculum of placement. Very easy. You meet annually to review the IEP. All you're really doing is now we're going back to step 2. Do we like the goals? Do we have to, step 4, do the goals make sense? Are you meeting them? Do they need to be revised? Do you have data to provide to the school to revise the IEP? Your child typically should be reevaluated every 3 years. That's called the triennial. But if you think he needs to be reevaluated, my son had really bad brain swelling a few years ago. He needs to be reevaluated. I don't know where he is, right? If your child is suddenly having behavioral issues, yeah, needs to be reevaluated. If you're seeing him slipping back in something, or wow, he's actually progressing so fast, I think we actually need to reevaluate him to see where he is goals-wise to improve the goals. You can have your evaluations more than every three. Okay. Again, keep it simple, stupid. If you're the 10-page letter mom, that's really not the mom or dad you want to be. You want to really whittle down your issues to 2 or 3 key points for the school. Here are my picks, all right? I think for the mild to moderate group, got to learn how to read. You need to read to get a job. You need to read to understand the medicine on the label on your medicine. You need to read a menu, right? Pragmatics of conversation. I'm noticing that a lot of the children here are over talkers or close talkers or loud talkers or seem to perseverate on things. These are things that the children should be working on, because in adulthood, those things are difficult to manage and difficult for them in a work environment. Socialization and behaviors. When is it appropriate to talk to someone, to follow somebody, to engage in conversation? Very important for those that are on the mild to moderate range. For those of us on the severe range, again, being able to communicate your needs like pain, like whether you want a burger or a Diet Coke, and things related to independence. And then I would also add literacy to that. Just because you have a low IQ does not mean you can't learn to read. There's actually a lot of new data, and the Down syndrome community has done a terrific job with this, to show it takes time, it takes years of trying, but they can learn how to read. So I have some notes I took at the COPA conference last year with some email addresses that breaks down the elements of reading, how to teach a child with ID how to read, all the different kind of tricks and things that you can use if your child has intellectual impairment. That's what we tell our families. A kid who can't read by 8 is an emergency. So, here's some websites real quick if you want to take a picture of this. A Day in Our Shoes, it's a Facebook group, 26,000 people. I know Lisa Leitner, the founder. It is fantastic. She is fantastic. Great information there. Practical AAC, if your child uses an assistive communication device, a great Facebook group. Your Special Education Rights is my friend Jen Laviano. Her videos are on a running loop in my house. When I take a shower, my husband laughs. He's like, I feel like I'm having an affair with her, because her videos are always on, because she goes through all of the things we talked about in a way that's just burned into my brain. Family Voices of California, BRP has 2 sessions on there on the details of all these assessments that are needed for children with brain differences. You can go, it's a free webinar that you can listen to on your own time. Understood is pretty good. Council of Parent and Attorney Advocates, we're having our meeting in March if you'd like to come. Great way to meet advocates and other lawyers and really get down to the nitty-gritty of some of this stuff. And then your state's own disability rights page. Every state has one that has a lot of this information. Okay. So my son, really quickly, remember we were going to put him an hour away at a school that wasn't going to teach him anything. We did file for due process. The school district had to pay $70,000 a year to get him into a program to teach him how to learn on a communication device. And here is where he is a couple months ago.
No pizza. You have oatmeal. You have oatmeal.
No, you're gonna keep holding up.
Anyways, so he's pretty good at telling me what he wants to eat. All right, thanks, everybody.